True power doesn't lie in loud, screaming matches. Sometimes the most ruthless revenge is just a quiet, steady gaze that leaves the people who once trampled on you stuck in the mud forever. Welcome back to my channel. Today, James is going to show us the ultimate art of the silent clapback without uttering a single bad word. But before we get started, I have a little challenge for you. If today, while at the absolute peak of your happiness, you accidentally bumped into an old enemy, what is the one exact sentence you would drop to put them completely to shame? Drop your ultimate comeback in the comments down below so we can see who's more savage, you or James in this video. And now let's jump right into today's episode. The smell of antiseptic. That was the first thing that hit Diep's senses when the glass doors of the maternity hospital slid open. It was a cold, inorganic, sharp smell that felt absolutely threatening. The brutal sterility of this space, with its spotless white walls and blinding fluorescent lights, seemed to strip away every layer of safety she had just patched together on the misty hill. Diep walked across the cold tile floor. The vast waiting area amplified every sound. The feeling of her heels striking the floor created hollow, dry echoes. Instinctively, she shivered. Her chest tightened. A chill ran down her spine, crawling past her neck to bury itself deep in her mind. This place was too much like the past. But her fear right now wasn't the vague panic of someone who didn't know if she could become a mother. She had known about the existence of this little life since that day at the clinic, the one that smelled of sea salt with the rusty, squeaky ceiling fan. But precisely because she knew, the fear inside her now became more tangible and suffocating than ever. Did the exhaustion of her body that day leave any lasting damage? The pregnancy was incredibly fragile. Could this body, once cursed as dead soil, be strong enough to hold on to this sprout of life? Panic made her knees lock up. Suddenly, a steady weight settled onto her shoulders. James stepped up from behind. He gently slipped his hand into her coat pocket, separated her tightly clenched fingers, and intertwined his 5 fingers with hers. He squeezed tight. He stepped forward, shielding her from the harsh glare of the hallway lights, using his familiar scent on his shirt to pull her away from the freezing grip of her current fear. "Last time at the clinic, you had to take that news alone," James said softly. His deep, steady voice resonated right next to her ear. "But today, I'm here. From now on and forever, I won't let you or our child suffer any more anxiety. You've protected our baby so well. There is no curse. Let's go in." Diep squeezed her eyes shut. She took a deep breath. James's warmth was like an anchor, pulling her swaying mind back to the calm surface of reality. She opened her eyes, nodded, and walked with him toward the ultrasound room. The ultrasound room was dimly lit. The female doctor motioned for Diep to lie down on the bed covered with a pristine white paper drape. The crisp rustle of the paper echoed dryly beneath her back. James pulled up a chair and sat right next to the head of the bed. He took her hand and placed it on his thigh. His thumb gently stroked the back of her hand, a steady, reassuring rhythm. The doctor pulled up the hem of Diep's shirt and pumped a cold, clear gel onto her lower abdomen. The ultrasound wand began to glide. It pressed down, massaged lightly, searching. The room sank into a suffocating silence. There was only the low hum of the machine. Diep's eyes were glued to the plaster ceiling, her abdominal muscles tense. She didn't dare breathe heavily. The doctor's silence stretched on by the second, deepening her fear about her past exhaustion. "Open your eyes, Diep," James whispered. He leaned forward, his breath brushing lightly against her temple. Diep slowly opened her eyes and turned her head to the right. On the grainy black and white monitor, it wasn't a pitch-black void. Right in the center of the lens, a tiny point of light, much more defined than the faint dot at the fishing village clinic, was blinking. It was faint, but stubbornly clinging to existence. And then, the doctor flipped a switch on the keyboard. Thump, 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 thump. The sound echoed off the four walls of the dark room, fast, steady, and powerful, like the pounding hooves of a horse. It wasn't a mechanical noise. It was the heartbeat of life, the very first heartbeat they officially got to hear. In that exact moment, every barrier inside Diep shattered. The label of a useless woman was permanently ground into dust. Her baby was safe. It had resiliently survived its mother's exhaustion to rise up, proud and defiant. Tears welled up in Diep's eyes, streaming down her temples and soaking the hair at her sides. She let out a sob, her chest heaving violently. She turned to look at James. Her heart seemed to skip another beat. The man who had once calmly thrown away everything for her, right now, under the dim light, was crying. A single clear tear slipped from the corner of his eye, slid past his jawline, and fell quietly onto their intertwined hands. He didn't wipe it away. His eyes were locked onto the blinking light on the screen. James lifted their joined hands, pressed the back of Diep's hand tightly against his lips, and then rested it against his forehead. His trembling breath washed over her skin. In that cramped space, two people bearing deep scars used the most silent touch to soothe their insecurities, welcoming the sprout of life beating its truest rhythm. They stepped out of the hospital as the city began to sink into a sluggish afternoon. Diep's chest felt incredibly light. One hand still cradled the ultrasound printout. The other was wrapped entirely in James's steady grip. Outside the hospital gates was the chaotic rush typical of rush-hour streets. Blaring horns, the smell of exhaust from the bumper-to-bumper traffic, and the clutter of sidewalk stalls contrasted sharply with the quiet inside. James wrapped his arm around Diep's waist, carefully shielding her from the rushing crowd. But life sometimes sets up situations that are cruelly ironic. Oh my God, Diep! It really is Diep. A shrill, sharp, and muddy voice rang out from the rundown bus stop about 10 paces away. Diep froze. The blood in her veins seemed to turn to ice. Even though 5 years had passed, no matter how hard she tried to erase it, she recognized that voice instantly. Her former mother-in-law, the person who had personally swatted her bowl of rice to the floor and kicked her out of the house in the middle of a freezing, rainy night. She was standing there, swallowed by the crowd, waiting for the bus. She looked incredibly disheveled, ragged and worn down. Her graying hair was tied in a messy, greasy bun. She wore a cheap, frayed windbreaker and dirty flip-flops. Her hands were clutching 2 oversized plastic bags stuffed with rolls of toilet paper, a few styrofoam boxes of leftover cheap food, and random knickknacks. Seeing Diep walk out of the hospital, radiant and elegant in an expensive cashmere cardigan, and especially being shielded by a man beside her who exuded absolute power. The older woman's cloudy eyes bugged out in shock. For a split second, she blinked rapidly, unable to believe that the poor, subservient daughter-in-law from years ago was now standing in a world she couldn't even dream of touching. But then, her probing eyes slid down to the ultrasound paper Diep was holding. Petty jealousy, the bitter resentment of seeing someone she once trampled into the mud now living like a queen, made the vicious side of her rear its head. Ignoring the traffic, she waddled over with her 2 plastic bags, cutting across the sidewalk to block Diep's path. "Well, look who it is. If it isn't Diep," she broadcasted loudly, shameless enough to intentionally yell so passersby would turn and look. The corner of her mouth twisted into a crooked, malicious sneer. "What? After getting kicked out of my house for being barren and completely useless, I figured you were hiding in some rat hole. So, Managed to latch onto some rich idiot and rushed out to get knocked up with a bastard child to tie him down. Her filth, stench, and malice were like a pile of trash thrown straight into the air. Diep's body instinctively recoiled. Memories of the mental abuse, the stench of her ex-husband's liquor, and the humiliating helplessness of a domestic abuse victim made her unconsciously pull her hand back, take a step back, and duck her head. But she couldn't step back. James's hand had clamped firmly onto her back, keeping her upright, decisive, and strong as a fortress wall. He stepped up, using his imposing height to completely block Diep from the woman's filthy gaze. The temperature around James plummeted below freezing. There was no explosive anger, no yelling, not even an angry furrow of his brow. James just stood there, one hand casually slipped into his pocket, the other still protecting Diep's back, looking straight down at her with a quiet, bone-chilling gaze. It was the look of an eagle staring down at a pathetic insect thrashing about in a sewer. "You're blocking my wife's way," James spoke. His tone was deep and steady, not loud at all, but its weight was enough to suffocate the noisy street air. The woman flinched slightly under the stranger's lethal aura. Then she glanced at the Patek Philippe watch peeking out from under his shirt cuff and swallowed hard. But her peasant-like jealousy and bottom-feeder habit of making a scene still made her stick her neck out. "Who are you? You're being played by this fox. Do you know that back when she was at my house?" "At your house?" James cut her off. The corner of his mouth curved into a faint, utterly lethal smile. "Take a good look at yourself." James dropped each word sharp as a razor. "Look at your own miserable, pathetic state, and look at your family's torn-to-shreds life." The woman's jaw dropped, her face turning pale. James tilted his head, his eyes never leaving the old woman's face, now wrinkling in humiliation. "Your existence, to my wife's world right now, is worth less than the dust on the tires of this car. Stop trying to beg for attention." It wasn't a curse. It was an insult that utterly crushed the last shred of her ragged dignity. She trembled, her lips quivering without being able to utter a single word, her face flushing bright red. The eyes of every passerby were fixed on her with a mix of pity and disgust. James didn't wait for her to react. He leaned over, opened the car door, gently shielding the roof with his hand so Diep could get in, and then carefully shut it. An act of absolute dismissal, treating her like a passing whiff of polluted air. She nervously backed away, standing frozen on the sidewalk, watching the sleek SUV slowly roll away and blend into the traffic, leaving her behind at the dilapidated bus stop. Inside the plush interior of the car, James reached across the center console and took Diep's hand. "From now on," James whispered, pressing a soft kiss to the back of her hand, "you will never have to bow your head to any piece of trash from your past again." Diep's chest heaved. The fear had completely evaporated, giving way to a brilliant pride and absolute peace of mind. The ghost of her poor, dark marriage was crushed and left behind forever. The car didn't head back to their downtown apartment. In just a few days, their wedding would officially take place. Diep would put on the most expensive silk gown, and they would exchange rings in front of hundreds of guests. But before stepping out to face the noise and the suffocating standards of the official reception, James needed something else. He wanted to give her something that belonged only to the two of them, a vow of the soul, not a performative declaration. They drove toward the quiet outskirts. The sky had shifted to the deep purple of twilight. The car stopped in front of a gravel lot. Before them stood a small, humble church, tucked away amidst a grove of ancient pines. It bore the rustic, Protestant architectural style, built from oak that had faded to a silvery gray over time. They pushed the heavy door and stepped inside. The oak door creaked. The air inside was cool, carrying the scent of old wood and the decaying paper of age-old Bibles. The evening light filtered through the stained glass window above the altar, casting dappled, multicolored, and ethereal streaks of light onto the floor. Below the pulpit, Pastor Paul, a thin, elderly man with stark white hair and calm, ash-gray eyes, was slowly sweeping up dried leaves. Hearing the footsteps, the old pastor looked up. He didn't seem surprised. He just smiled kindly. James led Diep forward and sat down on the sturdy wooden pew in the very first row. The cool surface of the wood bore the scratches of time. Pastor Paul leaned his broom against the corner of the wall, pulled up a wooden chair, and sat across from them. The distance between the three was very close. "We are having a wedding in a few days," James spoke, his warm, deep voice echoing beneath the wooden vault. He intertwined his hand with Diep's. "There will be hundreds of people attending, but before standing in front of those strangers' eyes, we wanted to make our real vows here. A place with no one else but the silence of God." Pastor Paul nodded. His perceptive eyes swept over James's hardened expression and the exhaustion and insecurity still lurking in Diep's eyes. "A true marriage," Pastor Paul began slowly, his voice blending with the wind howling outside the window, "is not about two perfect, flawless people finding each other. When I look at you two, I don't see perfection. I see scratches, very deep scratches." Diep flinched slightly. She bowed her head, her teeth unconsciously biting her lower lip. Tears welled up as she recalled the awful confrontation just moments ago at the hospital gate. The ghost of poverty and the humiliation from her ex-husband's family seemed to remind her of her origins. Choking back sobs, she tremblingly confessed her scars, her sheer terror that her impoverished background and her trampled past would become a stain, a ridiculous joke among the high society she was about to step into. "I'm afraid I'm not worthy enough," Diep sobbed weakly. Pastor Paul didn't rush to reach out and comfort her. He extended his faded sleeve, pointing up at the massive, rough oak beams crisscrossing above, silently supporting the heavy vaulted ceiling of the church. "Do you see those massive wooden beams up there?" he asked, his voice echoing. "They are not premium wood chopped down from primeval forests. They are planks salvaged after a massive storm. They are full of scratches from crashing against hidden rocks, riddled with rusted nail holes." He paused, letting that naked truth sink into Diep's mind. "People once told me I should throw them away, that broken things never have the right to build a sanctuary. But I kept them. I used new nails to piece the deep cracks back together. And look up. They have stood firm here, proudly sheltering countless suffering souls from the rain and sun for 4 decades without collapsing once." He turned back to look at Diep, his eyes so gentle it made one want to fall to their knees and confess. "True happiness is always built from broken pieces. Being trampled on in your past is not something to be ashamed of. It is powerful proof that you fought and survived. A soul that was once shattered, when picked up and mended with love, becomes far more solid and profound than any naive soul that has never tasted a storm." Then he shifted his gaze to James. "And you, young man, you think that with your power and protection, you can build a beautiful glass cage to lock her inside, to protect her from all wounds. But love isn't about looking down from above with arrogant protection. Love is stepping out from behind that wall, standing equally by her side, braving the storms out there together, and saying, 'Your past is our foundation.' James listened in silence. His Adam's apple bobbed slightly. He looked down at his hand, which was entirely engulfing Diep's. He gently loosened his enclosing grip, then slipped his fingers in to intertwine tightly through hers. The very moment that silence and understanding enveloped them, a heavy creak rang out from the back of the church. The massive oak doors were pushed open. A cold wind rushed in from outside, blowing up the dust particles dancing in the light. At the far end of the dark aisle, a silhouette appeared. It was an older man in a long black overcoat, standing with an imposing yet solitary posture. The light from the window didn't reach him, leaving half of his face submerged in shadows. Chairman Huan. The tyrannical father who had once forced his will upon every aspect of James's life was now standing there. Ever since the day he witnessed his son's peace by the fire and realized Diep was carrying the family's flesh and blood, every layer of the chairman's proud armor had crumbled. He had accepted the truth back on the T-Hill. And today, he didn't come here to stop this vow ceremony, nor did he force them to prioritize tomorrow over today. He came as an aging father who had cast aside his ego. Chairman Huan slowly walked into a pew in the very last row, in the most obscured corner of the church, where the shadows sheltered his age and weariness. He sat down, as still as a stone statue. James turned his head slightly. The eyes of the two men met across the space tinged with twilight. In Chairman Huan's eyes, there was no more ruthless intimidation. It was a complex gaze, carrying the weariness of a lifetime of power struggles, and a silent concession. He had witnessed everything. He saw how his son, someone he had once molded into a soulless machine, was now holding that woman's hand with his very life. Pastor Paul smiled, seemingly understanding all the moral truths within this small space. He continued slowly, his voice echoing through the chapel, directed at all three people bearing deep scars. The greatest forgiveness is to forgive oneself, to forgive the stubbornness of the past, and to allow oneself to open up to happiness. In the back row, Chairman Huan slowly closed his eyes. An incredibly soft sigh escaped his lips, carrying the entire weight of the burden drifting away into nothingness. His son didn't need him to manipulate things, nor did he fear his punishment anymore. His silence today was the most priceless blessing. The evening light pierced through the stained glass, casting shimmering streaks of crimson and gold onto the faces of James and Diep. Diep turned to look at James. The tear still clinging to her eyelash fell, but the corner of her lips pulled into a radiant smile, completely letting go of every burden. The ghost of her poverty-stricken past and the massive shadow of the family's control, all of it had retreated into the past forever. "Now," James whispered, kissing the back of her hand, "we are ready, my love." The twilight outside gradually fell, but beneath the oak vault, the brilliant light of a new chapter had finally, truly begun. The vows had been witnessed. Soon they would proudly step into the center of the elite world, not with fear, but with the absolute pride of scratched pieces of wood that had weathered the greatest storms of a lifetime. So emotional and so fulfilling, right, guys? Chairman Huan's silence in the back pew of the church was probably the most priceless blessing, completely setting James and Diep's lives free. Those scratched-up wooden planks have finally leaned on each other to create a sturdy, lasting roof. At this point, do you guys think James's final words to Diep's ex-mother-in-law were savage enough? Don't forget to scroll down to the comments to see whose comeback does more damage, yours or James's. And guys, the soulful vows in the shadows are complete. Now, it's time to step into the brightest light. In the next episode, James and Diep's official wedding will finally take place. No more hiding, no more holding back. Diep will put on the most expensive silk gown and proudly walk right into the center of power under the flashing camera lights. Just how earth-shattering will this grand debut be? Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell to secure your VIP ticket to the super wedding in our next episode. Thank you so much for always tuning in. Bye for now and see you next time.